Why was everyone ignoring her at the briefing table? The map of Helmand Province glowed under the projector's white light, a blur of red markers and coded call signs. Around it stood a ring of officers, men with bars, medals, and that stiff posture that said they'd stopped listening a long time ago. And there she was, Chief Warrant Officer 3 Devellin Caraway, standing silent at the edge of the room, a flight helmet still tucked under one arm, her jaw set tight enough to hurt. Someone was talking about acceptable losses. Someone else said the words extraction impossible. And that was the moment she realized. They had already written 340 Marines off as dead. Outside, the desert roared. Helmand's summer heat made the air shimmer like liquid glass. The base generators hummed, the faint smell of jet fuel and dust filling the room. But inside that operations center, time seemed to stop. Devellin looked at the digital clock on the wall, 10:42. She knew that somewhere out there, in a ditch they'd never meant to die in, hundreds of Marines were bleeding into the dirt. Every minute they argued in this air-conditioned room, someone's pulse was fatting. No one met her eyes. She could have spoken then, she should have. But the memory of being dismissed, mocked, questioned for years had taught her one thing. Sometimes silence was the only way to measure who was worth listening to. The colonel at the map table cleared his throat. "We're standing down for now," he said. "We wait for air support." And that was it. Devellin blinked once, slowly, like she was memorizing the moment the world gave up. Helmand in August didn't forgive anything. Not weakness, not hesitation, not even thought. The sky bleached to white by noon, and the dust hung in the air like breath you couldn't exhale. Devellin had been stationed at Camp Leatherneck for 3 months, flying medevac and resupply missions across that scorched wasteland. She knew every wadi, every compound, every patch of open desert where a shadow could turn into an ambush. She had pulled wounded Marines out of fire that melted the paint off her Blackhawk's skin. She had flown night extractions so low her skids sliced through treetops. She had earned her air medal for valor not with words, but with hours spent flying into places everyone else avoided. And yet, this morning, when she'd walked into that room full of commanders, they hadn't seen the pilot with 900 combat hours. They hadn't seen the woman who had carried half their men home from hell. They saw someone who looked too young, too soft, too quiet. So they ignored her. She'd grown up in Fallon, Nevada, where the horizon stretched wide enough to make you believe in things bigger than yourself. Her father, a Marine helicopter pilot in Desert Storm, ran a civilian search and rescue outfit from a rusty hangar on the edge of town. She learned to fly before she could legally drive. By 16, she could thread a Hughes 500 through mountain passes in zero visibility and set it down on terrain that would make most pilots turn back. Her father never said, "This is a man's job." He said, "This is a thinking person's job," and most people stop thinking when they get scared. He taught her that fear wasn't the enemy, it was information. A message your mind sent to sharpen your focus. He used to tap her helmet and say, "Right here is where the real flight happens. The hands just follow orders." That stuck with her, especially now in a war where fear was the only constant. At 19, she enlisted, Warrant Officer School, flight training at Fort Rucker. The easy part was flying, the hard part was surviving the stairs. Every morning felt like a test she wasn't told about. Every mistake felt heavier, every success somehow smaller. Her classmates called her the bird girl. Some meant it as a joke, some didn't. She didn't care. She graduated top of her class in instrument navigation and tactical flight ops. The instructors said she had the kind of hands you couldn't teach, calm, precise, mechanical under pressure. In Kunar province, she'd once pulled a 4-man recon team out of a hot zone surrounded on 3 sides. Night, brownout, zero visibility. The co-pilot froze on the controls. She took over without a word, flew out by instinct and memory alone. When they landed, the medic threw up from shock. Devellin just unbuckled, stepped out into the cold night air, and watched the smoke curl up from the valley below. That was the night she realized. Courage didn't feel like courage when you were living it. It felt like control barely hanging on by a thread. Now standing in that Hellman briefing room, she felt that same thread tighten. The Colonel Ashford was in his late 40s, hard face, harder voice. The kind of officer who thought discipline could solve anything. His operations officer, Major Canella, had already written off the mission. No safe LZ, no comms, no air cover, it's suicide. Ashford agreed. They didn't need to say the rest aloud. The casualties were gone. Devellin heard the words but didn't move. Her heart was hammering, not from fear, but from clarity. She looked at the satellite map. The pinned company was 600 meters from the only landing zone wide enough for a Black Hawk. Open ground, exposed to fire from the ridges. Every instinct said, impossible. Every part of her said, not yet. She finally spoke, her voice cut clean through the chatter. I can get in there. The room went still. Ashford turned slow. Excuse me. I said I can get in, she repeated. If we wait for fire support, we'll be picking up bodies, not Marines. Silence, then the sound of Canella's laugh, short, sharp, cruel. Ma'am, he said, the word wrapped in sarcasm, you don't understand the tactical picture. You're a medevac pilot, not a combat decision-maker. Sit down before you get someone killed. Her face didn't move, but inside, something old and sharp twisted. She'd heard that tone before from instructors, from commanders, from the system itself. That tone that didn't need to say the word woman to mean it. She nodded once, understood. Then she walked out. Outside, the heat hit like a wall. The flight line shimmered under a white sky. Her Black Hawk sat waiting, dust coating its olive skin, rotors still. Staff Sergeant Pewitt was checking the hydraulics. Specialist Galindo was running diagnostics on the gun mounts. They looked up when she approached. We going up? Pewitt asked. She didn't answer. She was staring past them, beyond the barbed wire to the faint outline of mountains in the distance. Somewhere out there, 340 Marines were trapped in a crossfire, bleeding into the sand. Her mind replayed her father's voice. Fear is information. Use it. She closed her eyes, then opened them, sharp and steady. Finish pre-flight, she said. We're wheels up in 5. Galindo blinked. We have clearance. She met his eyes. We will. That was a lie, but it sounded like truth. By the time she reached the operations center again, her heart was pounding, not from doubt, but from the quiet certainty of what came next. Ashford was still at the map table, Canella beside him. The air smelled like coffee and dust. She stepped inside. Sir, I'm taking my bird and going in. Ashford turned. You're what? You heard me. I'm not waiting for air support. Those Marines don't have that kind of time. Ashford's voice dropped cold. If you lift off without clearance, you'll face a full investigation. You understand what insubordination means? Yes, sir. And you understand what it means if you die out there? Yes, sir, she said again. It means at least I tried. Canella moved closer, jaw tight. You're risking your crew and your aircraft for a lost cause. If you go down out there, no one's coming for you. Devellin looked him in the eye. Then I won't go down. And that was the last thing she said before she walked out. Word spread across the flight line fast. Other pilots stood outside their birds watching her crew climb in. Some looked angry, some looked afraid. None moved to stop her. Huang, her co-pilot, was already strapped in, the APU humming. The rotors began to turn, the air shimmering under the downwash. Ashford's voice came through the radio, clipped, final. Caraway, if you take off, your career is over. She keyed the mic. Copy that. Then she pulled pitch. The Black Hawk lifted into the air, blades cutting through the white heat. She leveled low, keeping under the ridgelines. Flying fast and dirty, the desert whipping past beneath them. 18 minutes to Sangan Valley. 18 minutes to hell. Inside the cockpit, her hands moved automatically. Check altitude, torque, fuel flow. But her mind was somewhere else. She remembered her father's hangar, the smell of oil and wind, the first time she felt a machine answer her like it had a soul. She remembered every face of every Marine she'd ever pulled out of fire, the way they clutched at her hands like she was something holy. She was just stubborn enough to fly when no one else would. Huang's voice broke through the noise. "Talk to me. What's your plan for LZ?" "Drop from the west," she said. "Fast descent, flare hard, 30 seconds on ground max." He looked at her. "That's suicide." "Only if we hesitate." The world outside blurred, desert turning to smoke, the sky pulsing with heat and distance. She thought about Ashford's voice, about the phrase acceptable losses. Then she thought of something her father once said when she was 16, after she'd clipped a rock ridge in a crosswind landing. He'd grounded her for a week and said quietly, "You can't save everyone, but the ones you can, you never leave behind." Her hand tightened on the collective. She whispered, "I'm not leaving them." The altimeter dropped, the engines roared. Ahead through the haze, the valley opened up wide, pale, burning with fire and dust. And Devellin Caraway flew straight into it. The valley looked dead from above. Smoke clawed at the sky. The ground was a chaos of craters, shattered vehicles, and scattered movement that didn't make sense until you realized it was people. Men dragging each other through the dust, crawling, waving for help that wasn't coming. Devellin's jaw locked tight. Huang muttered, "Jesus Christ," but she didn't answer. She was already mapping the approach in her head, angles, crosswinds, elevation, threat zones. Her eyes moved like clockwork, scanning for something the satellite feed couldn't show her. 600 meters east of that ridge," she said. "That's our LZ." Huang shook his head. "That's open ground. They'll chew us up before we touch sand." She adjusted the cyclic, voice calm. "Not if we're faster than their trigger fingers." A beat of silence. Then Huang exhaled hard, almost a laugh, but not quite. "Copy that." The radio hissed alive. A Marine on the ground, call sign Phantom 2-1, his voice ragged, bleeding through static. "Eagle Dust, this is Phantom 2-1, be advised, we got wounded stacked like cordwood. LZ is hot, repeat, hot as hell. RPGs from the East Ridge. We can't hold this ditch much longer." Devellin keyed the mic. "Copy that, Phantom. Keep your heads down. I'll be there in 90 seconds. There was a pause. Then the Marine's voice came back, half disbelief, half relief. "You're actually coming?" "Affirmative." "Ma'am, it's suicide down here." Her answer was a whisper that only the cockpit heard. "Not today." The descent began like falling into another world. The Black Hawk dropped from 2,000 feet to 400 in seconds, blades screaming against the air. Devellin's heartbeat slowed, not sped up, the world narrowing to the rhythm of instruments and instinct. Pewett's voice crackled from the intercom. "Door guns hot." "Galindo, visual on friendlies. They're popping smoke, green smoke marking wounded." The horizon tilted, the world spun, the ground rushed up. RPG trails streaked past the windshield, white contrails cutting across the sun. One detonated 50 meters to the right, the shockwave slamming the aircraft sideways. "Hold it," Huang shouted. Devellin gritted her teeth, corrected, dropped again. Faster, lower, reckless. A round punched through the canopy glass, spiderwebbing the corner. The sound was deafening. She didn't flinch. She'd already switched off fear. That switch had been flipped long ago, somewhere between Nevada skis and Kunar gunfire. 30 seconds, she said, voice even. "Copy," Huang replied. The Black Hawk hit the LZ in a cloud of dust and thunder. Skids slammed down. Rotors whipped up sand so thick it turned the sunlight brown. The cabin filled with shouts, movement, gunfire. Pewitt and Galindo were out first, M240s hammering the ridges. The smell of cordite, oil, and blood mixed in the air. Marines appeared through the dust, faces blackened, uniforms shredded, dragging stretchers with arms that barely worked anymore. "Go, go, move them," Pewitt yelled. Devellin kept one hand on the collective, the other on the cyclic, eyes locked on the gauges, her brain split in two. One part pilot, one part human, both praying the other wouldn't break. Rounds hit the fuselage like hail. The windshield trembled. Warning lights blinked red. Fuel pressure fluctuating, engine torque spiking. But the engines held. 10 seconds, she shouted. Still loading, Pewitt answered. Make it 5. More Marines staggered through the dust, 3 carrying a 4th who was barely breathing. They shoved him inside. Blood pooled across the deck. The medic worked fast, hands slick. Devellin's ears rang from the gunfire, from the constant echo of explosions outside the glass. Somewhere behind her, an RPG detonated close enough to rock the tail boom. She heard metal tear, felt the vibration through her seat. Galindo yelled over the comms, tail hit but stable. Copy. Her fingers tightened on the controls. Strap in, she shouted. Then she pulled pitch. The Black Hawk surged up in a violent climb, dust falling away beneath them, tracers streaking past like orange lightning. The helicopter groaned, shaking, overburdened with weight. Come on, she muttered through her teeth. Come on. At 300 feet, another burst of machine gun fire ripped across the left side. One bullet punched through the fuselage near her knee, slicing fabric but missing skin. She didn't even look down. Huang was white-knuckled on his side. We're too heavy, she won't climb. She'll climb. Devellin. She'll climb. The engine screamed in protest, rotors straining. Then inch by inch they rose. The valley fell away. Below, the Marines in the ditch waved, tiny silhouettes, alive for now. Back at Leatherneck, the medics were waiting. As soon as the Black Hawk touched down, stretchers were offloaded, shouting replaced by the dull rhythm of urgency. Devellin kept her helmet on, breathing hard, watching through the canopy as they worked. Blood streaked the floor. Hydraulic fluid dripped near her boots. Refuel, rearm, she said quietly. Huang turned to her. You're not serious. I'm going back. He stared. We just got shot to pieces. She looked at the bullet hole near her leg. And yet, we're still flying. Word spread fast. Pilots, ground crews, medics, they all heard it. She was going back. By her third trip, the sun had started to shift. The valley air shimmered with heat and smoke. Each approach was worse than the last. The Taliban had learned the sound of her rotors. They waited for it, aimed higher. But she kept coming. At some point between her 4th and 5th run, she stopped counting the bullet holes. She stopped counting the names over the radio too. She only counted heartbeats, theirs, hers, the ones fatting faster than time allowed. On the 5th flight, something inside the left engine coughed. The torque dropped, and Huang swore, hands flying over the switches. Left engine torque is dropping. We're losing pressure. Compensate, she said. Compensate with what? We're already at red line. She didn't answer. She was too busy coaxing the machine with the kind of touch that bordered on prayer. The valley floor rushed up again, the same riverbed, the same burning hell. Marines waiting, faces turned upward like they'd learned not to hope until they heard that specific rhythm of blades. She came in fast, faster than before, too fast maybe. The descent was almost vertical. Huang yelled, "You'll roll us." "Not if you believe in me." He didn't know whether she was talking to him or the helicopter. The skid slammed down again. Marines surged toward them. The smell of dust and smoke filled every breath. Galindo's gun jammed mid-burst. He cursed, clearing the feed with trembling fingers. Pewitt screamed for another litter. Someone outside was crying, not from fear, but from pain so deep it made sound come out wrong. Devlin's heart hurt in a way bullets couldn't touch. She whispered to herself, "You're almost home." The load signal came through. She lifted again, nose down, the bird barely clearing the ridge. Behind them, the LZ exploded. 1, 2, 3 impacts. The sound rolled through her chest like thunder. If they had waited 2 seconds longer, none of them would have made it out. By the sixth trip, her hands were shaking. She'd been flying for hours, fuel cycling, rotors screaming, eyes burning from sand and exhaustion. Every landing was a gamble, every takeoff a miracle. She didn't think about medals or orders or consequence anymore. All she thought about was the next one, the next Marine, the next minute she could steal from death. At some point, between another radio check and another desperate voice on the other end, she caught her reflection in the cracked glass. Eyes red, skin gray with dust, a thin streak of blood across her cheek she hadn't noticed before. She didn't look like a soldier. She looked like someone pulled apart and rebuilt mid-flight. And still she kept flying. Back at the base, Major Canella watched from the tarmac as her Black Hawk came in again. Holes in the fuselage, one rotor blade shredded, paint stripped by sand and fire. He didn't speak, didn't move. Because no one had ever seen a pilot keep flying a bird that should have fallen apart 3 missions ago. When Devlin landed, the crew staggered out, faces hollow with fatigue. Pewett's arms were streaked with blood that wasn't his. Galindo's lips were cracked from shouting over the guns. Devlin stayed seated, hands still on the controls, breathing steady. Huang leaned forward. "You can't go again." She looked at him. "You can stay if you want." He didn't argue, he just stared at her for a long time, then turned back to the console. "Let's get her ready." When she lifted off for the 7th time, no one on the ground tried to stop her. They just watched. The sun was dropping low behind the mountains, the desert light turning gold and red. Inside the cockpit, everything was vibrating, trembling. Her body, the bird, the line between what was courage and what was madness. She could hear her father's voice again. "Sometimes, the only permission you need is your own." And as the Black Hawk cut through the dying light, heading once more toward the valley that refused to die quietly, she understood something she hadn't before. It wasn't about defying orders. It wasn't about proving them wrong. It was about one truth, one that she felt down to her bones. If you have the power to save someone and you don't, the silence that follows will never let you rest. And that silence was the one thing she could never live with. The desert light was dying when her radio went silent. No chatter, no call signs, just the steady thump of rotors and the whisper of wind bleeding through bullet holes in the fuselage. The valley ahead was a smear of smoke and fatting color, orange bleeding into gray. She made 6 runs into the Sangan kill zone, and each time the bird came back more broken. But this last one, this was the one that would break her. "Fuel's low," Huang said quietly, scanning the gauges. "We've got 20 minutes, maybe less." She nodded but didn't look. "We only need 10. Devlin. 10 minutes, she repeated, voice steady but soft. "After that, they're gone." He didn't argue, not anymore. He just stared at the horizon and prayed she was right. As they crossed the ridge, the radio hissed, finally, like the valley was breathing again. "Eagle Dust, this is Phantom 2-1. We're down to our last mag. 40 wounded still in the ditch. Do not attempt another run, LZ's gone. It's a crater now." Devlin keyed her mic, voice calm. "Copy Phantom, mark new LZ." Static, then, "New LZ," a beat of disbelief. "Ma'am, there is no new LZ." Devlin exhaled slowly. "There will be." She banked left, scanning the terrain. Flat stretches of baked earth, torn irrigation canals, burning vehicles. Then she saw it, a patch of open sand, smaller than regulation, sloped and uneven. Suicide by the book. "Perfect." She keyed the mic again. Green smoke if you can, I'm coming in from the west. Huang shook his head. You're out of your mind. Then we're halfway there. They dropped fast. The sound was different this time, deeper, rougher, like the helicopter itself was tired. The rotors struggled to bite through the thin air. Torques maxed, Huang shouted. I know. Hydraulics in the red. I know. It didn't matter. None of it mattered. The ground erupted below, tracers, explosions, screaming. Her body moved faster than thought, hands and eyes acting as one. She slid the bird sideways, then nose down, skimming the ground, cutting into the smoke like a ghost. And for one impossible second, everything went quiet. She could see them now. Marines waving, limping, blood-soaked, dragging their brothers through fire and dust. A field hospital of the damned. The skids hit sand, hard. She felt something crack, maybe metal, maybe bone. Go, 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 she yelled. Pewitt and Galindo were out before she finished the word. The back doors flew open. The gunfire became a roar. RPG fire streaked overhead, missing by meters. The concussion shook the cockpit, raining grit from the ceiling. Huang's voice was somewhere behind her. We can't stay. I know, she yelled back. Every second stretched. The sound of stretchers, screams, the slap of boots on metal. Then another impact, closer, the tail pitched, warning alarms screamed. Huang grabbed the controls, tail rotors hit. Devellin's eyes flicked across the panel, hydraulic pressure dropping, controls sluggish. Get them on, she shouted. Devellin, we're losing flight control. Get them on. Pewitt's voice through comms. That's all we got, move. Devellin pulled pitch too hard, too fast. The helicopter lurched sideways, then caught wind and clawed upward, dragging a cloud of sand and smoke into the air. The engines screamed, but they lifted, barely. Behind them, the LZ exploded in fire and shrapnel. No one spoke. The world was all noise and light. She pushed the collective forward, coaxing every ounce of lift the rotors had left. The gauges trembled. The vibrations grew worse. Come on, girl, she whispered to the bird. You've got one more climb in you. They cleared the ridge at 200 feet, then 300. Then the tail rotor gave out. The helicopter swung violently, nose pitching left. Huang grabbed the stick, trying to counter. Auto-rotation, she shouted. Too low. Then make it enough. They fought the spin together, two pilots, one dying machine. The desert blurred below. The airframe groaned like a wounded animal. Devellin's mind slowed again. She saw flashes of her father's hangar, the old Hughes 500, the way he'd told her, the bird will talk to you if you listen. And she listened now, with everything she had left. Her voice dropped to a whisper, talk to me. The controls softened, the spin eased. For a heartbeat, the helicopter leveled. Then the skids hit the ground hard, once, twice, bounce, roll. The world went white. When she opened her eyes, everything was smoke. Her headset was gone. The cockpit glass was shattered. The world sounded far away, muffled like she was underwater. Her right hand still gripped the collective. Blood dripped from her palm. Huang's voice came from somewhere beside her. You good? She blinked. I think so. He laughed, a broken, disbelieving laugh. We're alive. Her throat burned. Check the crew. Pewitt's voice answered weakly. Still here, little crispy, but here. Galindo coughed through static. Door guns gone, tails done, but yeah, we're still in one piece. Devellin looked around. The bird was half buried in sand, smoke pouring from the rear section, but the rotors were still, the engines silent. They survived a crash in enemy territory. Where the hell are we? Huang muttered. Halfway to the ridge, she said quietly, halfway to nowhere. It took 6 minutes for the first Marines to reach them, those she'd come to save now running toward the wreck that had almost joined them. Hands pulled open doors, shouts, movement. "Everyone out," Pewitt ordered. "Now." Devellin climbed out last, boots hitting sand. The world tilted for a second, then steadied. She looked back at the helicopter, the bird that had carried them through hell and finally laid down. Smoke curled from the tail, black against the twilight. It looked almost alive. And for a second, she wanted to apologize to it. "Thank you," she whispered. They waited in the growing dark. Somewhere behind the ridges, artillery thundered. The rescue birds finally came, 3 of them, following the beacon from her emergency transponder. As the first one descended, a Marine grabbed her arm. His face was bloodied, eyes wide. "You came back," he said, almost in disbelief. She nodded. "We heard they called off all flights, said it was suicide." Her voice was quiet. Maybe it was. He looked at her for a long time, then said something she never forgot. "Then I guess we were worth dying for." When the final extraction lifted off, she didn't take the controls. She just sat in the cabin, staring out the open door as the valley disappeared below. The sand glowed red in the last light of day. Smoke rose like ghosts. Beside her, a Marine clutched the hand of another man whose uniform was soaked through with blood. Neither spoke. They didn't need to. Devellin's eyes burned, not from the smoke this time. She turned away before anyone could see. Hours later, when they landed back at Leatherneck, the base lights looked unreal, too bright, too clean. The medics swarmed the wounded. The flight line was chaos again, but a different kind of chaos, organized, human, alive. She climbed out slowly. Every step felt like it belonged to someone else. Her flight suit was torn, blood on her sleeves, dirt under her nails. Ashford was waiting. He didn't say anything right away, just looked at her, then at the helicopter behind her, what was left of it. 47 bullet holes, he said quietly. Hydraulics gone. One main rotor fractured and you still flew it. She didn't answer. He stepped closer. You saved 341 men today. Her voice was hoarse and broke every rule doing it. He almost smiled. Some rules deserve breaking. Then his tone shifted. There'll be an investigation. Article 92, failure to obey. She nodded. I understand. He studied her face for a long moment. No, Chief, I don't think you do, but maybe someday you will. He turned and walked away. And just like that, the quiet hit her harder than any gunfire ever could. That night she couldn't sleep. She sat alone in the hangar, staring at the shredded remains of her helicopter. The air still smelled of oil and burnt metal. Her hands trembled, not from fear but from release. The silence was heavy, alive, the kind that follows after you've given everything you have to give. She thought about the men she'd flown out, the faces, the weight. And she thought about her father's voice again. The worst thing a pilot can do is hesitate when someone's life is on the line. She whispered into the empty hangar, I didn't. Then she cried, not loud, not broken, just quietly, the way strong people do when no one's watching. Because sometimes survival isn't triumph, it's aftermath. And in that silence, Devellin finally understood what her father meant by trust. It wasn't just believing in your crew or your machine. It was believing in the small voice that says, go anyway. Even when the world says you shouldn't. No one knew what to say to her the next morning. The base was alive again, mechanics shouting, birds refueling, boots crunching across gravel, but every sound felt distant. The day after a miracle always does. People looked at her differently now, not with disbelief or dismissal, something quieter, something that lived somewhere between awe and fear. But no one spoke. Because no one knew what you were supposed to say to someone who'd broken every rule and somehow brought everyone home. The investigation started before sunrise. Ashford's voice had been waiting for her when she woke, calm, clipped, official. Chief Carraway, Report to operations at 700. She didn't need to ask why. By the time she walked in, 3 men in pressed uniforms sat behind a table stacked with binders. The air smelled like coffee and sweat. They didn't look at her like a person. They looked at her like a question that shouldn't exist. A young legal officer began reading from a sheet. Chief Warrant Officer 3 Devellin Caraway, you are under preliminary review for violation of Article 92, failure to obey a lawful order, and potential endangerment of U.S. personnel. She stood at attention, hands behind her back. Understood. The officer looked up. Do you have anything to say in your defense? She hesitated, just long enough to think about the faces, those Marines in the ditch, the ones who had reached for her bird like it was hope made of steel and noise. Then she said quietly, "No, sir, not yet." They asked her questions for hours. Why did you take off without clearance? Why didn't you wait for air support? Why risk your crew? Why disobey a direct order? Every question felt like a knife twisted slow, polite, professional. Her answers were short, controlled. Because waiting would have meant more dead. Because there wasn't time. Because I could. One of them leaned back, pen tapping the table. You understand that's not how command works, Chief. She met his eyes, then maybe command's broken. The room went still. Even Ashford, standing near the wall, looked up at that. She didn't apologize. When she left the briefing room, the heat hit her like a wave. Outside, the horizon shimmered under the weight of noon. Helicopters took off in the distance, other crews, other missions. Her own bird sat gutted on the tarmac, stripped of panels and dignity. Mechanics moved around it carefully, whispering like it was a wounded animal. Pewitt stood by the nose cone, cigarette in hand, sweat darkening his collar. He saw her and gave a crooked smile. They treating you like a hero yet? She shook her head, more like a problem they don't know how to categorize. He took a drag, exhaled. Same thing, isn't it? Letters started, arriving a few days later. First one, then another, then dozens. Handwritten, folded, smudged with desert grit. From the Marines she'd pulled out of the Sangin Valley. Most were short. You saved my life. I got to hold my daughter last night. They said we were gone. You proved them wrong. She kept them all in a small box beside her cot. She never replied. Because the truth was, she didn't know what to say. What do you say to men who call you an angel when you know it wasn't faith that got them home, just defiance and luck? The nightmares came next. She'd wake up sweating, heartbeat hammering, the sound of rotor blades still in her head. In the dark, she'd see the valley again, the flash of muzzle fire, the sudden burst of light when the tail rotor failed. She'd feel the vibration of the stick under her hands, the moment it all went quiet. Every time, she'd reach for the controls that weren't there. And every time she'd whisper into the dark, "You're still flying, you're still flying." But sleep didn't believe her. A week later, Ashford called her back in. He didn't sit behind the desk this time, just leaned against it, arms crossed, studying her. The board has concluded its findings, he said. Technically, you violated direct orders. That's not in dispute. She nodded, understood. He continued, they also concluded that your actions were taken under extreme combat conditions, that your decision likely prevented catastrophic loss of life. They're not pursuing court-martial. She blinked once, so that's it. He half smiled. Not quite. I'm recommending you for the Distinguished Flying Cross. She didn't react, not because she didn't care, because she didn't know how to. Ashford's voice softened. You did good, Chief, better than good, but you knew that already. Her throat tightened. No, sir, I didn't. He nodded slowly. Then maybe that's why you were the one who had to do it. That night she sat by the flight line alone. The desert was quiet, too quiet, the kind that makes you realize how loud war had been. The stars above Helmand looked unreal, sharp enough to cut glass. She closed her eyes and listened to the wind move across the sand, and for a moment, she could almost hear the faint thump of rotor blades again. But it wasn't real, just memory. A part of her wished she could forget it. Another part prayed she never would. The next morning, a group of Marines came to see her. They didn't knock, just showed up at the hangar while she was checking the remains of her bird. The oldest of them, Sergeant Halbrook, stepped forward, a limp in his walk, bandages still fresh on his arm. He handed her a small patch, a torn piece of uniform fabric burned at the edges. "This was from the LZ," he said. "We found it where you landed the first time, figured it belongs to you." She looked down at the cloth in her hand, stained, sun-bleached, almost nothing. Her voice barely worked. "Thank you." Halbrook shook his head. "No, ma'am, thank you." The men behind him nodded. Some saluted. Some just looked at her the way people look at something they don't have words for. When they left, she stood there for a long time, staring at that burned piece of cloth until her eyes blurred. Then she folded it once, twice, and slipped it into her pocket. 2 days later, orders came through, rotation stateside. Her crew would be reassigned. The Black Hawk would be scrapped for parts. The story of Sangin was already spreading through the Corps like wildfire. They called her the Angel of Sangin. She hated the name. Angels didn't shake when the firing stopped. Angels didn't bleed, didn't break protocol, didn't question whether they'd done the right thing. She wasn't holy. She was human. And that was enough. Her father was waiting for her back in Nevada. He met her at the small airfield just outside Fallon, same place he'd taught her to fly, same smell of oil and wind and dust. He didn't rush to hug her, didn't ask about the war, just handed her a pair of flight gloves and said, "Let's go up." She smiled, for the first time in months. They took the old Hughes 500 up into the mountains, threading through the same narrow passes she'd learned to fear and love as a teenager. The air was thinner up there, cleaner. For a while they didn't speak, just flew. When they landed, her father shut down the engine, then looked over at her. "I heard about what you did," he said quietly. She looked out the windshield. "Yeah. You scared them." She smiled faintly. "That wasn't the plan." "It never is," he said. They sat in silence for a moment. Then he reached over, rested a hand on her shoulder. "You know," he said, "what you did out there wasn't about flying." She frowned slightly. "Then what was it about?" He looked at her, eyes soft but sharp. "Trust." She said nothing. He continued. "Not in the machine, not in command, not even in the people around you. It was about trusting yourself when nobody else did. That's the hardest kind of trust there is." Her throat tightened. He added, almost to himself, "Most people spend their whole lives trying to find that kind of courage. You found it under fire." She looked down at her hands, still rough and scarred from the cockpit. "Doesn't feel like courage," she said quietly. He smiled. "It never does when you're the one living it." Later that night, she stood outside the hangar alone, the Nevada air cool against her skin. The stars looked the same as they did over Helmand, uncaring, infinite. She closed her eyes and heard the wind shift. For a second, it sounded like rotor blades again, steady, distant, eternal. And she smiled, because she finally understood. Sometimes the hardest battles aren't fought in valleys or skis. They're fought in silence, after the noise is gone. And sometimes the only reward is knowing you acted when it mattered most. She exhaled slowly, the air trembling in her chest. Then she whispered, almost to the stars, "Sometimes dignity doesn't speak, it simply acts." She thought coming home would feel like landing. It didn't. It felt like falling, slow, endless, silent. Nevada looked exactly the same. Wide skis, pale earth, the hum of heat that rose off the asphalt like a mirage. But she wasn't the same woman who'd left. She'd left in uniform. She came back in pieces. The first thing that hit her was the quiet. At Camp Leatherneck, silence meant danger. It meant waiting for the next explosion, the next call, the next flight that might be your last. Here, silence was supposed to mean safety. But every time the wind moved, she still heard rotor blades. At night, she'd wake up gasping, reaching for a helmet that wasn't there, her hands twitching for controls that didn't exist. The room would be dark, still, safe, and she'd hate it for being all three. She told herself it was just adjustment, transition, but it felt like withdrawal. Like part of her was still out there, circling over that valley, waiting to land. Her father kept the old Hughes 500 clean and running, like always. He'd find excuses to get her in the air. Routine maintenance, he'd say. You've got better hands than me anyway. And she'd go, because flying was the only time her head went quiet. But even then, she caught herself waiting for gunfire, for the smell of hydraulic fluid, for Pewett's voice through the headset yelling LZ hot. The peace felt unnatural. Her father noticed. He didn't say much. He never did. But one evening, as they flew low over the desert, he said, "You know it's okay to miss it." She frowned. "Miss what?" He shrugged. "The noise, the purpose, the part of you that only wakes up under fire." She didn't answer, because that was the truth she didn't want to admit. She did miss it. Not the war, but the clarity. Out there, every choice mattered. Every heartbeat was earned. Here, nothing did. She tried working civilian search and rescue flights for a while, mountain recoveries, desert crashes, missing hikers. She was good at it, everyone said so. Calm, efficient, never flinched. But she hated the looks, the local deputies whispering, "That's her, the one from Sangin." The newspapers had turned her story into something unrecognizable. Angel of Sangin, the pilot who defied orders, the woman who brought 340 Marines back from hell. They wrote it like legend. She remembered it like blood. Sometimes she'd find herself at a diner off Highway 50, halfway through her coffee, before realizing she'd been staring at nothing for minutes. People would approach her sometimes, veterans, parents, strangers. They'd shake her hand and say, "Thank you for your service." She'd smile politely, "Of course." But inside, something twisted, because "thank you" sounded too small for what war takes and gives. How do you thank someone for carrying ghosts? One afternoon, she got a letter in the mail. No return address, just a military postmark. She opened it slowly, hands trembling without reason. Inside was a photograph, grainy, sunlit, taken in someone's backyard. A man stood holding a little boy on his shoulders. The man's arm was scarred, his smile uneven. Under it a note. "You pulled me out of Sangin. He wouldn't exist if you hadn't. I don't have words, so I'll just say this. Thank you for the quiet moments." She stared at it for a long time. The letter didn't make her proud. It made her ache. Because for every life she'd pulled out, she still saw the eyes of the ones she hadn't. The ones who died before she got there. That's what no one tells you about being a savior. Every person you save just adds weight to the ones you couldn't. Months passed. The nightmares dulled, but they didn't leave. Sometimes, when she taught new pilots how to hover in high wind, she'd catch herself saying things her father used to say. "Fear's just data. Trust your hands. Don't think about the crash until you're clear of the ground." They'd nod, not understanding. How could they? They'd never flown through fire so thick it turned the world orange. They'd never watched a mountain pass shimmer with the promise of death and chosen to fly through anyway. She never told them what the lessons were born from. Because some truths don't teach, they haunt. One evening, she drove out to the edge of the desert, where the land turned to open nothing, and the horizon swallowed the world. The wind was cold that night, sharp. She brought the box of letters with her, The ones from Sangin, the photos, the notes. She laid them out on the hood of her truck, one by one. Then she lit a match. The flame caught slow, careful, the smoke curling into the wind. She didn't burn them out of anger. She burned them because she didn't need proof anymore. She had lived it. She had carried it. And somewhere between that first takeoff and that last crash, she had learned something she could never explain to anyone who hadn't been there. That bravery wasn't noise. It wasn't medals or headlines. It was the quiet after, the part where you still choose to get up the next day and live with what you saw. The next morning, she went back to the airfield early. The sun was barely up, the hangar door still cold with dew. Her father was already there, tinkering with a rotor assembly. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked. She shook her head, didn't want to. He looked up squinting. "You look lighter." "Maybe I am." He smiled faintly. "You finally let it go." She thought about that, then nodded. Not let go, just set it down for a while. He nodded slowly. "Good, that's how you carry it without breaking." She climbed into the Hughes, buckled in, and lifted off into the morning air. The desert unfolded beneath her, gold and endless. No tracers, no explosions, just sunlight and wind. She flew low, close enough to feel the ground through the machine. And for the first time in years, she wasn't running from the silence. She was flying toward it. Later that day, she visited a small airfield near Reno. An old Army buddy ran a training school there. They needed an instructor for high-risk recovery flying. "Most of our students just want the thrill," he said. "They've never flown in anything real." She smiled faintly. "Then they're about to." He studied her for a moment. "You sure you want this? Teaching means reliving it." "I know," she said, "but maybe that's how it stops owning me." He nodded. "Welcome aboard." Weeks turned into months. She built a quiet rhythm again, teaching, flying, eating alone, sometimes laughing when she forgot she wasn't supposed to. The nightmares still came, but softer now, like memories fatting at the edges. Every once in a while, she'd get a postcard, always from different people, always with the same message written somewhere near the bottom. "Still here because of you." And she'd smile just once, then tuck it away. Because she didn't need to answer. She already had. One evening, while instructing a trainee on a rescue drill, the helicopter banked into a sunset so vivid it looked unreal, gold bleeding into blue, the world quiet below them. The trainee was nervous, hands too stiff, movements jerky. Devellin placed her hand over his and said softly, "Stop fighting the wind. Feel it, trust it." He looked at her uncertain. "What if I mess up?" She smiled. "Then you learn, then you try again. That's how you get better." For a moment, her own words echoed back at her. Maybe that's what life was now. A series of second flights after crashes you weren't supposed to survive. That night, she stood on the tarmac alone again, watching the lights of Reno shimmer on the horizon. The air was warm, the sound of crickets faint under the hum of a distant rotor. She tilted her head, eyes half closed, listening. Not for the sound of war, but for something quieter. Peace. And when she finally heard it, faint but real, she whispered, "You made it out, Devellin." She smiled softly. "Now live like you did." The girl reminded her of herself. Same quiet way of standing at the edge of the group, half listening, half measuring every word. Same jawline set just a little too tight, like she was used to being doubted. Same spark behind the eyes, the kind you only saw in people who hadn't been broken yet, but knew they could be. Her name was Cadet Avery Knox, 24, smart, reckless, scared in all the right ways. And from the first day, Devellin saw what she was trying to hide, the hunger to prove she belonged. It had been 2 years since Sangin, 2 years since she'd flown through the kind of fire that rearranged your soul. And yet, every time she stepped into the cockpit, it still felt the same. The hum under her feet, the vibration through her chest, the way the sky opened up like a door that only she could walk through. Teaching had given her structure again, schedules, simulators, students who didn't know who she was until someone told them. And when they did, they looked at her differently. Some with admiration, some with disbelief. But Knox didn't. She looked at Devellin the same way she looked at the horizon, like it was something to reach for, not something to worship. The first time they flew together, the desert was calm. Knox's hands trembled on the collective. Devellin watched without saying anything. Finally, she said, "Stop fighting the machine." "I'm not," Knox said quickly. "You are," Devellin pointed at her shoulders. "You're flying tense. Helicopters feel that, they'll fight you back." Knox tried again, this time smoother. "Better," Devellin said, "but you're still scared." Knox glanced at her. "Of what?" Devellin looked out at the horizon. "You'll find out." That night, Knox cornered her after class. "Ma'am," she said, "can I ask you something personal?" Devellin hesitated. "You can try." Knox swallowed. "Did you really go back 7 times in Sangin?" The question hit harder than it should have. Devellin nodded slowly. "Yeah." "Why?" Devellin's answer came quiet, almost automatic. "Because they needed someone who wouldn't wait for permission." Knox frowned. "Weren't you scared?" She smiled just barely, every second. Knox looked down. "I think I'd freeze." Devellin studied her. "Everyone freezes. The trick is to move anyway." Over the next few months, Knox became her shadow, always asking questions, always pushing harder. She reminded Devellin of a time before the fear became permanent, before silence became her only safe place. One evening, Knox stayed late to practice emergency landings. The sun was low, the sky gold and violet. After her third rough touchdown, she sighed. "How do you make it look easy?" Devellin smirked. "I don't, I just make it look inevitable." Knox groaned. "That's not helpful." "It's not supposed to be," Devellin said. "You'll understand later." But later came sooner than either of them expected. One morning, during a mountain training exercise, Knox's aircraft lost power at 1,200 feet. Her voice came through the radio, sharp with panic. "Mayday, engine failure, auto-rotation engaged." Devellin's stomach turned to ice. She was in the second bird, 2 clicks south. She keyed her mic. "Knox, breathe, fly the fall." "I can't," she's spinning. "Yes, you can, listen to me." Static wind, the sound of chaos. "Eyes on the horizon," Devellin said, voice steady. "Don't look down, feel the drop, trust the air." For a long second, no response. Then through static, flare engaged impact in 3, 2, 1. The line went dead. By the time Devellin reached the site, Knox's bird was on its side, smoke curling from the engine housing. But she was alive. Bruised, shaking, alive. Devellin helped pull her from the wreck, arm steady, voice calm. Knox stared at her through tears. "I thought I was dead." Devellin nodded. "So did I." Then softer, "Welcome to the other side." That night Knox came to her quarters. She looked different, smaller somehow, her confidence cracked. "Ma'am," she said quietly, "how do you do it? Keep flying after you almost die." Devellin looked at her for a long time. "You don't, not really." Knox frowned. "Then why keep doing it?" "Because sometimes the only way to heal is to prove the fear wrong." Knox hesitated. "Does it ever stop, the memories?" Devellin's gaze dropped. "No, but they stop winning." Knox didn't know what to say. She just nodded slowly, eyes glistening. Before she left, she said something Devellin didn't expect. "Thank you for hearing me." Devellin almost laughed. "What do you mean?" Knox shrugged. "Most people just talk at me, you listen." She smiled faintly. "That's how my father taught me to fly. Listening's the difference between falling and landing." Weeks later, Knox passed her final exam. Perfect auto-rotation, clean landing. The base commander shook her hand. Outstanding work, cadet. Knox grinned, but her eyes searched the crowd until they found Devellin standing at the back, arms crossed, expression unreadable. When the ceremony ended, Knox jogged over. "You're not going to say it." Devellin raised an eyebrow. "Say what?" "That you're proud of me." A long pause. Then Devellin smiled, small but real. "I am." Knox laughed softly. "You're terrible at this emotion stuff." Occupational hazard. That night, after everyone left, Devellin stayed in the hangar alone. The old Hughes 500 sat under a tarp in the corner. She pulled the cover off, ran her hand along the frame. The metal was cool under her fingertips. She thought of Sangan again, the sound, the fire, the faces. And then she thought of Knox. Maybe this was what it was all for, not medals, not memory, but to pass something on. A kind of courage that didn't come from glory but from truth. She climbed into the cockpit, just for a minute. The seat creaked, the air smelled like oil and rain. She closed her eyes. In her head she heard her father's voice again. "Trust yourself, even when no one else will." Then her own answering softly, "I did, and now so will she." A week later, Knox stopped by her office. She had a photo in her hand, a shot of both of them standing by the training helicopter, desert wind whipping their hair. Knox handed it to her. "You should have this." Devellin smiled. "Why?" "So you don't forget what you gave me." Devellin looked at the picture. The two of them standing side by side, teacher and student, survivor and believer. She said quietly, "You don't owe me anything." Knox shook her head. "That's not how this works. You gave me something I didn't even know I needed." "What's that?" "Permission to trust myself." Devellin stared at her, unable to speak for a moment. Then she whispered, "Good, hold on to that. The world will try to take it from you." That night, Devellin stood outside under the stars again. The wind was gentle this time, warm. She thought about Sangan, about her father, about Knox. And she realized something she hadn't before. You never stop flying through fire. You just learn to steer through it differently. Her ghosts were still there, always would be, but they didn't scare her anymore. They just reminded her who she was. A pilot. A teacher. A survivor. And for the first time, that word didn't feel like a wound. It felt like flight. It started with a phone call she almost didn't answer. Unknown number, Washington area code. She stared at it until it stopped ringing. Then it rang again. She sighed, picked up, "Caraway." A voice she hadn't heard in years, steady, measured, familiar. "Chief, it's Ashford." For a second the world tilted. The airfield outside her window blurred. She swallowed. "Didn't think I'd hear from you again, Colonel." "I'm not calling as a colonel anymore," he said. "I retired, but there's something I think you should know." "Go on." He hesitated, and that hesitation told her everything. This wasn't small talk. "There's a UN relief op in Syria. Civilian extraction. Hostile zone. They need pilots who can fly in low under fire. Your name came up." Her first instinct was silence. Then, "I'm not military anymore." "I know," he said. "That's why they asked. It's a joint operation civilian contract. No orders, just choices." She almost smiled at that. "You think I still have one of those left?" He didn't laugh. "You're still the best stick I ever saw, Devellin, and I think you've still got something to prove to yourself, not to them." She told herself she was done with war. Done with the noise, the fear, the endless heat that lived in her skin. But the truth. Part of her missed it, the moment when the world narrowed down to skill and nerve. The place where instinct was louder than doubt. That night she sat in her hangar long after everyone had gone home. The Hughes 500 sat under soft yellow light, tools scattered across a workbench. She stared at her reflection in the cockpit glass. The woman looking back wasn't the same pilot who had flown into Sangin, older now, calmer, but her eyes still had that winter blue defiance. She whispered to her reflection, maybe one more flight. 3 weeks later, she was in Jordan. UN base outside Al-Mafraq, rows of tents, humid air, the distant thump of artillery from across the border. Her aircraft, a civilian-configured US-60M, painted white with blue UN markings, sat baking under the sun. The mission was simple on paper. Extract a group of aid workers trapped in a border village cut off by rebel fire. No combat support, limited airspace. In other words, impossible. And that was exactly why she was there. Her new co-pilot was a kid barely out of training, Lieutenant Isaac Morneau. Nervous hands, too much energy, eyes that still believed the world could be saved if you just flew hard enough. He reminded her of Knox. On their first briefing, he said, "You really flew in Sangin, right? The one they call the Angel of." She cut him off gently, "Don't." He nodded, embarrassed, "Sorry, ma'am." "Don't call me ma'am either," she said, "just Devellin." He blinked, "Even if we're under fire." She smiled faintly, especially then. The flight plan was short, 30 miles north, through a narrow valley into the border zone. But she knew terrain like this. She could feel it, the tight wind patterns, the way heat distorted depth, the dead air pockets that waited to flip a bird that came in too heavy or too proud. As they lifted off, the desert light hit her face. For a heartbeat, she saw Afghanistan again, the same color sky, the same taste of dust on her tongue. Her chest tightened. She exhaled slow, "Stay low, follow my lead." Morneau's voice crackled through the headset, "Copy, Devellin." The hum of rotors filled the sky. And suddenly she was back. Halfway through the flight, the radio came alive with a panicked voice. "This is Ground Team Alpha taking small arms fire. Request immediate evac, coordinates inbound." Devellin looked down. Through the haze she could see the village, small, broken, surrounded by smoke, vehicles burning, figures moving through the alleys. "Got visual," she said. "Brace for fast descent." Morneau's hands trembled. "You've done this before, right?" She glanced at him, calm as ever, "Once or twice." They dropped fast, hugging the terrain, dirt and wind hammering the windshield. The smell of burning oil filled the cockpit. "LZ ahead," Morneau called, "but it's narrow." "Perfect," she said. He frowned. "You keep saying that." "That's because it always is, until it's not." The landing zone was barely big enough for skids. Houses flanked both sides, smoke curling from open roofs. The ground was uneven, sand, rubble, rebar. Civilians were running toward them, aid workers, locals, children. Devellin's voice cut through the chaos. "Get them on, quick." Gunfire erupted from the far ridge, sharp, rhythmic. Rounds sparked off nearby walls. Morneau flinched. "They're shooting at us." "They're not aiming well," she said, scanning her instruments. "Yet." He looked at her like she was carved from steel. Within seconds the cabin was full. 9 passengers crammed in, 2 bleeding, 1 unconscious. "Load secure," Morneau shouted. Devellin pulled pitch hard. The helicopter leapt upward, rotors screaming. Then impact. A round tore through the tail housing. Warning alarms flared red. Morneau cursed. "Tail hit, controls sluggish." She adjusted instantly. "Compensate torque, keep her nose up." "Copy." They climbed through the smoke, the ridge rising behind them like a scar. More rounds cut the air. One cracked the side window, another ricocheted off the landing gear. Devellin kept her voice calm, steady, almost clear. Morneau was shaking now. "How are you so calm?" She smiled faintly. "Because fear's just data, and right now we've got plenty." He laughed once, half mad, half awed. And for the first time, she felt something she hadn't felt since Sanguine: clarity. That stillness in the chaos. The peace that comes when you have nothing left to lose but your nerve. They broke through the valley mouth, sunlight exploding across the cockpit. The radio crackled. "Eagle 1, you are clear of hostile range." Devellin exhaled, shoulders finally relaxing. "Morno," she said quietly, "you did good." He looked over wide-eyed. "We almost died." She nodded. "That's how you know it counted." He laughed again, shaking his head. "You're insane." "Probably," she said, "but alive." When they landed back at the UN field, aid workers swarmed the helicopter, pulling survivors out. Devellin sat in the cockpit for a moment, watching. The relief, the crying, the small human miracles that follow every brush with death. Morno turned to her. "That was—" He couldn't finish the sentence. She nodded. "Yeah." "Was it like this in Afghanistan?" he asked quietly. She looked at him for a long moment. "No." He frowned. "No." She turned away. "This time I knew we were coming back." That night, Ashford found her sitting alone by the aircraft. He'd flown out as an advisor. Old habits die hard. He sat beside her without speaking. For a long time, neither of them moved. Finally, he said, "You could have said no." She nodded. "I know." "Why didn't you?" She stared at the desert horizon, the stars shimmering faintly over the ridges. "Because I needed to know I could still go back there, without staying there." He smiled softly. "And did you?" She exhaled. "Yeah, I think I did." He nodded. "Good, you earned your peace, Chief." She looked down, voice quiet. "No, Colonel, I made it." When the mission wrapped, she flew one last time solo. Just her and the bird, low over the Jordanian desert. The air was smooth, the horizon endless. She didn't think about Sanguine this time. She just flew. For the first time in years, it wasn't to save anyone. It wasn't to prove anything. It was just because she could. She returned home 2 weeks later. The sun over Nevada felt different now, warmer, softer. Knox met her at the airfield. "You went back," she said. Devellin nodded. "Yeah." Knox studied her face, and Devellin smiled faintly. "And the sky's still the same. I just fly it differently now." They stood in silence for a long time. Then Knox said, "You're not afraid anymore, are you?" Devellin looked up at the horizon, eyes reflecting the fading light. "No," she said, "I just finally understand it." That night, she wrote in her flight log for the first time since Sanguine. Location: Jordan border. Mission: civilian extraction. Outcome: all survived. Notes: fear isn't something you outgrow. It's something you learn to fly with. She closed the book, exhaled. Outside, the wind moved softly across the hangar, rattling the metal siding like distant rotor blades. And somewhere deep inside her, the storm finally settled. The desert was quiet again. Years had passed since Sanguine, since Jordan, since the day she stopped asking herself if she'd done the right thing. Now she just lived. Most mornings began the same way. Coffee gone lukewarm on the wing of her helicopter, the horizon bleeding gold. She liked the routine, the stillness, the sound of nothing trying to kill her. But every now and then, when the wind shifted just right, she could still hear echoes, the faint whine of rotors, the stutter of gunfire, the ghosts of engines that never really stopped turning. She didn't run from them anymore. She just nodded, like old friends passing by. Her father was older now, his hair gray, his hands slower on the tools, but his eyes, those sharp Nevada sky eyes, were still the same. When she walked into the hangar that afternoon, he looked up from the workbench and smiled. "I heard about Syria," he said. She chuckled softly. "You hear about everything." "I try," he said. "You all right?" "Yeah." And for once she meant it. He wiped his hands on a rag, studying her face. "You look different," he said. "How so?" "Like someone who finally stopped arguing with the world." She smiled faintly. "Maybe I just got tired." He shook his head. "No, you got wise." They went flying one more time. The air was thin, clean, the kind that burns in your lungs but clears your head. The old Hughes 500 rattled like it always had, part machine, part memory. He let her take the controls halfway up the ridge. "Still remember how to listen?" he asked. She smiled, "Always." They flew in silence for a while, mountains below them, the long shadow of the aircraft stretching over stone. Finally, he said, "You ever think about what it cost you?" She hesitated. "All the time." And she took a breath. "It cost me who I was, but it gave me who I am." He nodded slowly. "That's about the best trade any of us ever get." When they landed, the sun was dropping behind the mountains. He climbed out stiffly, leaving her in the cockpit. For a long time she just sat there, hands resting on the controls, the air warm against her face. She could still see the Sangin Valley in her mind, the fire, the smoke, the impossible light. But now the memory didn't tighten her chest. It just was. Something that had happened, something that had shaped her but no longer owned her. She whispered into the quiet, "We made it out." And for the first time she believed it. That night she sat on the porch of her father's house. The desert wind carried the smell of rain, a rare thing in Nevada. Lightning flickered far off in the hills. Knox had sent her a message earlier that day. "Got my wings today. Couldn't have done it without you." Devellin smiled at the screen, then set the phone down. She didn't need to reply. Some messages answer themselves. She looked up at the night sky. The stars were bright, endless, the same ones she'd seen over Helmand and Jordan and home. The same ones that never cared who lived or died beneath them. And somehow that felt comforting. When she finally spoke, it was barely more than a whisper, the kind of voice you use when the world has already heard enough noise. "I used to think courage was about not being afraid," she said softly. "It's not. It's about doing the thing that scares you again and again until the fear becomes part of the rhythm." She took another breath, slower this time. "And I used to think survival meant coming home, but it doesn't. It means finding a way to live with the home that comes back to you." The wind shifted. The old hangar creaked. Somewhere in the distance, a single engine echoed against the desert floor, maybe a training flight, maybe just imagination. She smiled, because the sound didn't hurt anymore. It just reminded her that the sky still belonged to her. Inside, her father had fallen asleep in his chair, the radio humming low. She covered him with a blanket and paused for a moment, watching his chest rise and fall. She thought about all the lessons he'd given her, the ones about flying and the ones about living. Then she walked back outside barefoot, the sand cool under her feet. The night was vast, quiet, whole. She tilted her head back and whispered to the stars, not as a prayer, not as confession, just as truth. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak, it simply acts. And the desert listened. The wind carried her words away. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was peace. And for Chief Warrant Officer Devellin Caraway, the woman who once flew into hell because no one else would, that was enough. Fade out soft music, voice over reflection. Courage isn't about the noise we make. It's about the silence we earn after the storm.